Good afternoon, and welcome to this session for the Decatur Book Festival, sponsored by Emory University. And they told me we're getting feedback. Is that better?
Sure.
Yeah. I think is this okay now? I'll be brief. They'll be using different mics. Our authors and our moderator will be signing their books at the end of the session. We ask that you exit through the rear of the sanctuary and go around to the left. The signing tent will be on the green lawn to your left. There will be no Q&A for this session. The books are available for purchase from our bookseller, Eagle Eye. And please remember that the Decatur Book Festival is a nonprofit organization dependent on donations and grants. So if you feel so moved, please go to their website, decaturbookfestival.org, and consider making a donation so we can continue to have these wonderful authors who come to our city every year. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for the session, who is Chris Joyner, who also happens to be a personal friend. I'm delighted to be able to introduce him. Chris is an investigative reporter with the AJC and more than 2 decades experience in journalism, ranging from community newspapers, to national and international news and wire services. He reported from the scene of Hurricane Katrina. I wondered if you had any flashbacks this week. And the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of 2010. As an investigative reporter, he focuses on uncovering hidden communities and has written about street gangs and life inside a supermax prison, the hidden world of government lobbying, and a white-collar criminal network built around a drug testing lab. His new book, The 3 Death Sentences of Clarence Henderson, is the story of a man in West Georgia who was sentenced to death 3 times for a crime he did not commit. So I hope that you will consider looking at Chris's book and having him sign that too. Thank you, Chris, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I appreciate it. As Jerry said, I'm Chris Schwerner. I'm an investigative reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and it's my pleasure to bring you 3 authors of 3 fascinating true crime books. And although I typed this out earlier, I happened to work out it's in the right order. So, Catherine Miles is author of 5 books, including Quakeland and Superstorm. Her essays and articles have appeared in publications such as Audubon, Best American Essays, Best American Sports Writing, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, Outside, Politico, and Time. A contributing editor at Down East magazine, Miles also serves as a scholar-in-residence for the Maine Humanities Council and as a faculty member in several MFA programs. She lives in Maine. She has run a half marathon to get here. Her new book is the recently released Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. Next to Catherine is William Rawlings, born and raised and still lives in Sandersville, Georgia, where he's a 6th-generation resident of Washington County. A physician, he was educated at Emory, Tulane, and Johns Hopkins, and holds an honorary degree from Mercer University. For the last 2 decades, he's also been a very productive author with a total of 12 books, including 6 suspense mysteries set in the South and 6 works of Georgia and Southern history. His most recent book is the Columbus Stocking Strangler. And on the end, we have Mark Pinsky, who is a journalist, an author, and whose career has been composed of 2 strands, writing about social justice as a complement to political activism, and straight reporting for traditional establishment outlets, bringing social justice issues to broader audiences. He's probably best known, though, as the author of the best-selling The Gospel According to the Simpsons, the spiritual life of the world's most animated family. He's also the author of The Gospel According to Disney Faith, Trust, and Pixie Dust, A Jew Among Evangelicals, A Guide for the Perplexed, and Amazing Gifts, Stories of Faith, Disability, and Inclusion. His new book is Drifting into Darkness, Murders, Madness, Suicide, and Death Under Suspicious Circumstances. So in reading these books, I'm struck by the approaches that you've all taken in telling your stories. And William, if I could start with you. Many Georgians remember the brutal slayings of 7 older women in Columbus in the 1970s and the eventual arrest and prosecution of Carlton Gary for those crimes. It's a story that got a lot of press for a lot of years, and yours isn't the first long-form treatment of the case. So I'd like you to start by talking about your case and what you wanted to do with a story you believed that had not already been done, or at least not been done in an authoritative way.
Sure. Well, to back up a little bit, if you're from Georgia and old enough, you'd certainly remember the so-called Stocking Strangler. To give you a very brief summary, during an 8-month period in 1977 and 1978, 7 quote-unquote elderly, ranging in age from 59 to 89, average age 70, 7 elderly white females who were single and lived alone were brutally beaten, strangled, and raped in Columbus. This occurred in a very small area of town, about a total diameter of perhaps a mile or 2 miles. 5 of the 7 were strangled with stockings. And after this brief period of time, the case went cold. The case stayed cold for about 6 years when, through a very complicated, fortuitous series of circumstances, a gentleman named Carlton Gary was identified, arrested. He came to trial in 1986. The trial lasted about a month. It took the jury 1 hour to convict him in 3 of the 7 killings, which is all he was actually charged with. He was sentenced to death in August 1986, and 32 years later, in March 2018, was executed by the state of Georgia. This was a complicated case, to say the least, and you mentioned that several people had thought about writing. This book fell into my lap, actually, when my publisher asked me if I would do it. I had actually started on another, I had a book contract to write a book on tattoos, which, by the way, is a great, interesting subject. My wife hates the idea. She thinks I'm going to get one. I don't have any, thank you. But a lady named Jackie White, who was a very good writer and had written several true crime books, was considering doing this work. She got ill and later died with colon cancer. And the book, I inherited some of the research, but nothing else. As I said, it was a very horribly complicated case that spanned in excess of 40 years. A number of people had set out to write about it, but in truth, nobody had really completed any definitive book save one, which came out in 2007, was titled The Big Eddie Club. And those of you that are from Columbus will know that this is a private social club. This book was allegedly a definitive work, although it was more than 11 years before the end of the tale when Gary was executed. The book was controversial in the sense that the gentleman who wrote it was an excellent writer, a guy named David Rose, but he also wrote it with an agenda, as he was a death penalty opponent. And many people in Columbus felt that this was a book that reflected his pre-existing opinions about the case. You ask what I sought to accomplish. In writing this book, I simply wanted to tell the truth, the facts. And so the book, as far as I know, is complete. My book is completely factual, and it's sort of the Jack Webb, just the facts, ma'am, sort of book that tells a terribly complicated tale of a very tragic series of circumstances that over a period of nearly half a century resulted in the known deaths of 7 women in Columbus, plus other murders and other horrific crimes in New York and in Georgia and in South Carolina. It's a complicated tale. It's over now, and the book is out.
And it is a very complicated tale, in part because it does cover, multiple decades, and there are a lot of twists and turns. You tell that story in a very straightforward TikTok fashion, from the murders through the culmination of the case. And Catherine, I want to talk to you about your book, because you make different choices in how you approach structuring your book. Your story involves the 1996 deaths of Lolly Winans and Julie Williams, a young couple murdered in a secluded area of the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. A years-long search with national implications for a suspect, and the serious questions raised about the conclusions the investigators arrive at. More than that, it's your story. You're a central character in your book, and this choice makes it a very passionate and personal read. I'd like you to talk about that journey and how you decided to structure the book the way you did.
Because my editor made me, is the short answer. I had been personally invested in this case since it happened in 1996. I had never met Lolly or Julie, but in a lot of ways they were my contemporaries. We had all grown up in the Midwest. We had all been sexual assault survivors who had really found a sort of sense of redemption and healing backpacking, especially on our nation's long trails. And when they were murdered in 1996, I had just graduated from college, and that murder, along with several other of women and people who identify as queer on the Appalachian Trail, had really had a very sort of profound impact on me and really altered my relationship with the natural world. So that had always been with me. And then, by utter coincidence, my first college teaching job after graduate school was at a small environmental studies college where Lolly had been a student when she was murdered. And, when I got there, it was 500 undergraduates and 30 faculty. So a very tight-knit community where alumni tended to stick around. And so even though Lolly wasn't there sort of physically, I think, her spirit was really everywhere on that campus. And when the 20th anniversary of these crimes occurred, I was the trail correspondent for Outside Magazine and had pitched the article to my editor as what I thought would be a very straightforward feature story that kind of looked into the crime, talked about why the crime had been so hard to solve. The FBI had been very vocal about the fact that they were certain that they had the right guy. In 2002, there had been an indictment of a man named Daryl David Rice for this murder, and in his indictment, the federal government had used brand new hate crime legislation that allowed them to seek the death penalty. They had very quietly dismissed the case about 2.5 years later, but they dismissed it using a concept called without prejudice, which basically means that they can bring the case back against him at any time. And when I talked to the FBI for what I thought was going to be a magazine article, they were very clear that they continued to believe beyond any doubt that Daryl Rice was the perpetrator. So I went into the magazine article thinking that's what I was going to write about, that we just needed one more piece of DNA or one more sort of enhancement to the way that DNA is testing so that we can finally put Daryl Rice behind bars. And I think that as an investigative journalist, that was a real blind spot for me that I did not go in. I think, like a lot of Americans, I just assumed that, the Justice Department had done its work, and of course they had the right guy, and it never occurred to me that the story was going to be a lot more complicated. And it wasn't until I started digging into it for the feature story that I began to realize that not only was there no evidence associating Daryl David Rice with this crime, but there was, in fact, significant evidence, I think, tying a known serial killer to this particular crime. So that's where it really shifted in terms of the narrative. I had really planned to report it as just sort of a straight up TikTok, kind of very distanced third-person narrative. And when I submitted the manuscript to my editor, she kind of called BS on me. And she was like, listen, I've been hearing these stories that you've been telling me throughout this whole thing. I know that this is a personal story. You need to be a part of it. And I really pushed back against that hard. First, because I'm a journalist and I love to hide behind other people's stories rather than having to tell my own. And then also because I really didn't want to seem like I was trying to appropriate Lolly and Julie's story and at all compare my experience as a sexual assault survivor with their experience both as sexual assault survivors, as a young lesbian couple in 1996, and then ultimately as murder victims. So I went into it very apprehensively, but in the end, I really do believe that she was right, and that both in terms of my integrity as a journalist and recognizing that I was not an objective observer of this case, and kind of owning that and kind of owning my interest in the narrative made it a stronger book.
I want to come back to some of those themes. Mark, in talking about sort of personal involvement in a book, I think you have a sort of, I know as a journalist, a unique experience in this book. Your story is about a 2004 double murder of a wealthy Montgomery philanthropist couple, Brent and Charlotte Springford, which you had a personal connection with because it was your sister-in-law who came to you with it. Is that correct? Correct. She's a death penalty lawyer and was representing the defendant in that crime, who was the couple's adult son, Brent Springford Jr. First, if you tell us about the book and the involvement of Carolyn Scout, the alleged Native American shaman who came in to Brent Jr.'s life. And then if you would talk about the incredible amount of information you had access to and how you became more involved than really most authors would in the way the story progressed.
Sure. I'd like to say two things. First, one, I read Kate's book, liked it, reviewed it, and have recommended it to many people because it mirrors a case I wrote about in 2013. From personal involvement to the Appalachian Trail, really eerie echoes of the same thing. And I had one of these nightmare bookstore visits not so long ago in Alabama where nobody shows up. And I perused the shelf, and I came upon your book. And I said, that's the book I wish I should have written. So we'll say that. I like to say this is my 7th book. Sometimes you choose the book, and sometimes the book chooses you. In this case, the book chose me. In 2009, I was in Santa Fe celebrating my wife's 60th birthday with her sister and her husband. She was in Santa Fe because there was a seminar on death penalty mitigation. My sister-in-law, who's from Atlanta, was a late-in-life lawyer and came to the field of death penalty mitigation. The federal courts have said that if you think your defendant is likely to face the death penalty at the end of the trial, you need to engage someone called a death penalty mitigation specialist. My sister-in-law was ideal for this. She was both an attorney and a clinical social worker. And her job, anyone's job to do this, is to prepare a profile of the defendant to be presented at the end of the trial, either to the prosecutor, the judge, or a penalty phase jury, explaining why this person shouldn't be executed, totally apart from the guilt or innocence. It's a sociological profile to say they were abused when they were growing up, or they never did anything wrong before, but it's just to save the life. It's a very high wire act. If you succeed, your client lives, and if you fail, your client dies. In 2009, my sister-in-law said, I just finished a case I think you might want to write about. And most of the people who she deals with, as in most death penalty cases, were people of color and poor people. But she came into this case involving Brent Springford Jr. about a gifted, young, but troubled white person, Brent Springford Jr., went to Vanderbilt for 2 years and dropped out. And my sister-in-law had basically saved him from death row. But she said, you know, something still troubles me. I believe that the person who orchestrated and manipulated this crime got away with it. Because the young man who I defended was so under this woman's sway, she claimed wrongly to be a Native American shaman. He was so under her sway that he would not roll on her even to save his life. And my sister-in-law said, I want you to write a book that will be the trial that this woman never had. And so I said, well, I'll think about it. And I wrote her a memo, never heard back from her. 4 years later, my first true crime book came out in 2013. Then she called me again and said, now's the time, I want you to write this book. I said, well, I'll see. And she sent me 15 file boxes of the case files. And it contained the normal things, the paper trail, the police reports, autopsy, et cetera, et cetera. So, which was great. It saved me some time. Also, transcripts of some of the interviews that she and her other attorneys conducted. But then she was so intense in her preparation that she had collected from both the 2 dead victims and the person who was accused, so by that time had committed suicide, and others connected with the case. She collected emails, letters, faxes, entries in personal journals, and for me, the best thing of all was because it was a capital case, she had access to the accused's psychiatric records, which in this era of HIPAA, you just can't get. It's almost impossible to get. And when she sent me this young man's psychiatric records, the records were 1.5 feet off the floor. So quite often with true crime writers, because so many people are dead, particularly with the cold case, you're reduced to saying, well, X must have thought Y, or X probably thought Y. But with this treasure trove of interior material that my sister-in-law gave me, I was able to write, this person was thinking this. At this time, they thought this. They were afraid of this. And it gave so much more gravitas to the narrative, I couldn't say no. So I spent the next 4 years writing this book, and what happened, I became so involved with it that there was another murder that popped up involving the same person, Caroline Scout, in Wyoming, and for the first time in a career of 50 years of journalism, much of it involving crime and criminal justice, the police asked me to help them. Now, this never happens. Maybe on TV, but it never happens. Police and investigators, they'll shine you on. You're only trouble for them. But I found a guy out in Wyoming, a deputy sheriff, and he said, well, tell me what you know about this case. And after I told him what I knew that he didn't know, because it was a alleged suicide with a gun, just didn't pan out, I said, whatever you do, don't sign the death certificate. Because if you sign the death certificate, the insurance company will pay off for this death. So he said, well, why don't you come and see me? So I'm running along, but I'll say that and this never happened, they asked me to be part of their task force in investigating this other murder. And it was an incredible experience to see something that I always suspected, but to see how the police work from the inside, and in that sense, to help them. If I was still a staff writer, I would never do that. Journalists, A, do not become part of the story, and they don't work with police. But, you know, I'm 75. I don't have anything to lose at this point. I mean, whatever career I've had, so that's it. So I think I probably talked enough.
And I want to open this up a little bit for the 3 of you to talk about something. Everybody's writing about really a different period. You know, in each period impacts the story, and some of these, you know, William, your book covers, honestly, you know, 40 years of American history. But of course, a book is also a product of the time it's written. And in each one of these books, you're having to navigate questions of race and gender, sexuality, complicated family dynamics in ways that we understand today that maybe were not understood in that same way during the actual events of the book. I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you thought about some of these issues as you were writing and doing the research.
Well, to start with the Columbus case, there was a lot here that really could make someone think that the police and judiciary mishandled this case, and I'll give people credit for that. Columbus, is anybody here from Columbus? Oh, good. Columbus has an abominable...
None of this leaves this room.
Columbus has an abominable history of race relations, and that was always something lurking in the background of this story. The way I handled this was the prologue of my book is an excerpt from a newspaper report talking about how the city had been terrorized. The first chapter, however, is a brief history of Columbus that starts off something to the effect that the city of Columbus is built on land that was acquired by treachery and paid for in blood, if I remember my own words, and goes on to document the history of racism and race crimes in Columbus involving not only Native Americans but also persons of color. when the when the Strangler's reign of terror began after the first two killings, a poor gentleman, a black man named Jerome Livas, gave a quote-unquote confession to the police, admitting to the first two crimes. But he was mentally challenged. In fact, he was a pitiful sort of fella. And fortunately, a reporter, Carl Cannon for the Ledger-Inquirer, managed to interview him independently and also got him to confess to the Kennedy and the McKinley assassinations, and got him to confess being present when the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped in the 1930s or 1920s, I forget. Anyway, the prosecutors in Muskogee County had the good sense not to even consider presenting this. So when this whole thing got started, there was a cloud of suspicion on the police and to a lesser extent on the judiciary. And the way I handled this, again, is the same way I did everything else. I simply told the truth and didn't cut any corners and didn't try to hide any of the abominable history that had preceded this horrific series of events.
I'll go ahead and jump in and just say that I appreciate everything that you said. For me, going into this book project, I really came at it primarily as a reporter who was really interested in the environment and the relationship that we form with the natural world. I didn't have a real background in reporting on either crime or exoneration or carcery studies, and so that was all kind of a learning curve for me. And so kind of was this genre that we call true crime, and should probably kind of unpack maybe if we have time and talk about what that even means. But what I did know as a sometimes consumer of true crime is one of my own personal, it's stronger than a pet peeve, it's almost really a loathing about some true crime, is that it really tends to foreground the killers, to the point that the killers, I think, are almost romanticized, and the victims become almost these kind of secondary flat characters, right? These almost kind of objects. And going into this project, what I knew personally was that the only way that I would be able to undertake this project and kind of deal with the emotional constraints that come with it is that if I was really focusing on giving back Lolly and Julie their agency. That was super, super important to me. So I knew to do that and to keep them the main characters of the book, I would absolutely need the full participation and agreement of their family and friends. And so the very first thing that I did was I approached their families. And when I contacted Julie's parents, their understandable concern was, they said, listen, our daughter has already been so politicized, and what assurance do we have that you won't do that? And it was exactly the right question to ask. Lolly and Julie were in a same-sex couple in the mid-1990s, and I think in 2022 we tend to forget that, being out, as what we now say is LGBTQ+, was just really kind of a difficult space to negotiate in 1996. The AIDS crisis was still very real. We didn't really have a lot of antecedents for this, and so they had mostly kept their relationship secret for a variety of reasons, including from their family. And it was on the day of their funeral that they were very publicly outed in the national newspapers by what I hope was a well-meaning but overzealous Presbyterian minister who felt like the case wasn't getting the attention that it needed from then Attorney General Janet Reno. And so she was the first person to write this very public letter saying this was a hate crime. They were targeted because of their sexuality. And so in the case of Julie's parents, they literally learned of their daughter's sexuality an hour before their daughter's funeral because it was on the front page of the Chicago Tribune and the Minneapolis papers and everything else like that. And then in 2002, when then Attorney General John Ashcroft, who was under a ton of pressure post-September 11th to show that he was willing to be tough on hate crimes, settled on this case as the first federal hate crime, again, it became predominantly about about Lolly and Julie's sexuality. And their families were like, look, you know, that was private, and of course we embraced our daughter's sexuality, and had we known, we would have embraced it, and we knew Lolly, and of course we embraced her, but our daughter is not a political tool, right? So how do we know you're not gonna make her a political tool? And so for me, trying to both sort of recreate that kind of sexual zeitgeist of the 1990s and then also handle the politicization of these two women without further being a part of it was the real challenge that I felt like I had to tackle.
I've been writing about racial, social, and economic injustice for 50 years. That's why I became a journalist, and I try to bring that viewpoint to everything I've written. I've written 2 true crime books later in my career. One involved the murder of a young woman on the Appalachian Trail in 1970 in western North Carolina. She was my age, and I identified with her at that moment. And for 40, almost 50 years it took me to write that book. I felt she was one of us, the 60 generation, and she had been left out on the field, and someone should find out who did it. And that's what drove me over, say, 40 or 50 years. My second book was set in Montgomery in 2004, and to write that story, I needed context too. So I talked about the Southern Poverty Law Center, I talked about Jefferson Davis, I talked about, you know, racial relations, and that was always the context. I wish that in both books, racial justice, social justice, economic justice, were all in the foreground. I mean, I write for politics. Unfortunately, with nonfiction, unlike fiction where you're omniscient and, you know, omnipotent, you have to paint what you see. And I wished, I'm getting back to what Chris said, when I saw his book, I thought, that's the book I should have written, that put race at the very center of the narrative. But one story came to me one way, another story came to me at a different way, so it didn't work out that way. But politics, unlike I understand the family would not be interested in that, that's always at the foreground for me. I always want to serve the cause of justice in any way that I can, and that's how I sleep at night.
Since I think we've all written in other areas, and we're sitting here on a true crime panel, I'm kind of interested, because Catherine brought it up. How do you view true crime as a genre, and how do you feel like you're fitting into that, or maybe how do you feel like you're escaping it? Let's start with you, William. And also I'd also point out that William's the only non-journalist up here. He's a physician, and I think that may give you different perspective as well.
Well, I'm a physician. I'm actually a retired physician in a small town. And the nice thing about being a physician in a small town is you can go in and shut the door and ask questions and actually expect people to answer them truthfully. And you can never, ever, ever pass this information on, but it sure gives you a lot of ideas. So, what was the question again?
Yeah, it's about. I mean, you've written straight history, you've written fiction.
Yeah,
and here this is a true crime.
To put a true crime in perspective from my particular writing, somewhere on my website, the top of it says author of Southern Stories. What I look at and what fascinates me are stories, and be they fiction or be they nonfiction. The interesting thing about why I enjoy writing history, for example, about Southern history, Georgia history, is that they're interesting stories. And when we were in school in the 8th grade or 10th grade or whatever, and and you had to remember that in 1860 this happened, and in 1972 that happened, and history so often becomes a dull litany of facts. But if you have people and individuals and emotions and unexpected twists and turns in this quote-unquote history, that's what makes it fascinating. True crime is a whole nother genre. I've written 2 books. One was an earlier book called 6 Inches Deeper, Mercer's University Press, and they didn't like the title, but they said, oh, that sounds suggestive. And I said, yes, that's going to make people pick it up and look at it. But what I find fascinating about this particular book that I wrote, the Columbus Stocking Strangler, and in fact everything else I've written, is picking out stories to tell and finding the interesting things that make them more than a litany of facts, that put personality into them, that produce conflict, that have a protagonist and an antagonist. And most importantly is unexpected twists and turns. In other words, you're going this direction when all of a sudden you turn the next page and it goes in that direction and then this direction. And when you get through with it, you say, gosh, I didn't expect that. Be it truth or be it fiction.
I want to pick up on something that Mark said earlier about this idea of sort of like the role of journalists and this idea that we can somehow, work towards justice. And I've always been really motivated by this idea of journalists as the fourth estate, that we can do this kind of watchdog work. And one of the things that's always really motivated me is, the so-called like little guys who are, not getting the justice they deserve, or, they've had their land removed by eminent domain, or, their drinking water is contaminated or whatever, and they feel like nobody cares. And if I can go in and tell their story and kind of make it part of the larger narrative, then I'm doing some really good work. And, in the course of this particular book, I ended up partnering with the Innocence Project, and really just became, I think, just utterly committed to the work that they do, especially working with exoneration work, which is not something I had any background in. And so that became a hugely motivating component for me, was just understanding first, how many cold cases there are. I think there's something like 200,000 unsolved murders right now in the United States that have grown cold. So these are cases that basically have gone into a desk drawer somewhere, and those are families who have never had closure and never had a sense of justice served. And then meanwhile, what we're beginning to understand, in part because of enhanced DNA testing, is just how many innocent people are either on death row or serving life sentences. And so that was news to me, and it's certainly something that's proven incredibly motivating for me and has really kind of redirected, I think, my journalistic career right now. I just wrapped up a story about people, largely people of color, who have been wrongly convicted of what we used to call shaken baby syndrome, based on what doctors used to know as the triad, which has now kind of been disproven. And so this kind of work to me just feels really meaningful. And I think that this is a place where true crime, both in terms of writers and also readers and consumers of it, I've been really heartened by the crowdsourcing that's been happening, that's either solved one of these cold cases, like the 3 guys recently who cracked the Zodiac Killer Code, or I don't know if anyone's seen, what is it called? It was this Canadian show. It was called like Don't Fuck with Cats. Yeah. That's what it's called. Right. And so this idea that people who are consumers of true crime, who are also become experts on these stories, can work with journalists or work with themselves to somehow either prove that an innocent person has been incarcerated, or bring a case to closure in a way that has, I think, a lot of healing, not only for the families, but also the sort of secondary people who associate with that particular crime.
I think, if you look at American history or European history as well, for 200 years, true crime was considered a very lowbrow entertainment, from the Police Gazette through the True Detective magazines. That world literally changed with the emergence of the podcast Serial, which has been in the news again because of the case. And following soon on that, this explosion of podcasts, but also the explosion, COVID's part of the responsibility, of streaming services. And the appetite for true crime as entertainment, I have to say, has exploded. And the market has exploded, sending people looking back for old cases. At the same time, it's gotten more serious. So books like Kate, not just titillating, but move the needle somehow, to actually become a part of it. And I think I'm of two minds here. Anyone who writes about true crime, if they're honest with themselves, knows that they're in some way profiting from the misfortune of others. And you can never leave that very far from your mind. And I have to say, I don't read true crime for entertainment. I don't find it entertaining. I don't watch it for that. If I'm on the screen, I'll watch it. Or if it's my story, I'll write it and hope people read it. But The other side of the true crime explosion, I think, is this sort of turning it into entertainment, and that, frankly, troubles me.
I think that's really interesting, and sort of taking serial as a point of demarcation. I think you're right. It moved the genre, even though it was not a book, it was a podcast, moved that genre into the realm of more narrative nonfiction, and expecting a true crime story to carry more weight than just the crime itself. Has anybody else got some thoughts on what's been happening with that genre? Because it is everywhere. I mean, if you are a subscriber in Netflix and you have not been recommended one of their true crime documentaries, you're not getting your money's worth, because they have plenty. You have some thoughts about where the genre is right now in the literary marketplace?
I mean, it's huge. I don't think, if you all have an idea for like a streaming 8-part documentary series, I would really encourage you to pitch it right now. Maybe not Netflix, they're having some hard times right now, but definitely pitch it to Hulu or Amazon or whatever, because there's just this insatiable taste for it. And one of the things I started to wonder when I was working on my book is why. And I talked to some folks who are very, very active on some of these listservs and discussion boards and things like that, because I was trying to get a handle on why some of these people who had, again, never met Lolly and Julie were working so hard as amateur sleuths or, armchair investigators on this case. And I really wanted to know why, so I started going to places like CrimeCon and things like that. And what people told me, especially women, again and again and again, is, the more I know, the less scared I feel, which at first was really counterintuitive to me, because a lot of those shows just scare the bejesus out of me, and I can't watch them at night or read it when I'm working on it or things like that. But what people kept telling me again and again is, if I can study these cases, if I can figure out how and why they happened, if I can figure out the psychology of the perpetrator, I feel like less of a potential passive victim. I feel like I have a fighting chance. And that really resonated with me in some really deep ways. And I think it sort of tapped into a really collective fear that I think we have about violence in our culture that I think is, justifiable, and that people want answers, people want to feel prepared, people want to feel like they have the agency to protect themselves if they need to.
William, picking up from there, I think your experience is really interesting, because you said you received hate mail before your book was even published. I mean, you're talking about a connection with the reading public. That's a pretty big one, and I think it's because your story really taps into the heartbeat of that community. Can you talk a little bit about that community reaction?
As I said, we're talking now about the so-called Columbus Stocking Strangler, a black man named Carolyn Curry. Again, he was convicted in 1986 he was only charged with 3 of the 7 murders in Columbus and convicted of all 3 for murder, rape, and burglary, and was sentenced to death, he was executed in 2018. Okay. The other book I referred to vaguely, the Big Eddie Club, came out in 2007. There were people that said Gary was innocent. They based that more on emotion rather than reality. If you look at the facts, it's hard to say by any stretch of the imagination that this person was innocent. There were efforts to accuse another killer and so forth and so on. The case went through the judicial system to the U.S. Supreme Court on 4 separate occasions, and none of the evidence was overturned. And multiple attempts to get a new trial he was not granted a new trial. As his attorney, actually it was a magazine article that came out this month where someone reviewed it, and the guy that wrote the article called up his defense attorney, and his defense attorney said, well, he was legally guilty. Well, but he shouldn't have been executed. Even his defense attorney admitted it years later, apparently, based on what I read in a magazine article. But it's hard to find the truth. It's hard to sort things out.
After, to some degree, denigrating the true crime genre, I should say that there's another development underneath that, which Kate alluded to. I can't remember her name, but the TV critic for The New Yorker had a collection of essays that came out about 1.5 years ago. I reviewed it, and it's called I Like to Watch, but she wrote about the true crime genre and said that it has emerged in recent years as a secondary appeal system. So where cases, there were not sufficient evidence to determine who did what and bring it to trial, because prosecutors have a different standard than general public is. These shows, some of the more serious ones of the streaming service and the podcast, have again emerged as a way to get justice where the legal system has been unable to find justice. And that fits the two books that I wrote. If I can't find out what happened myself, I don't want to write the book. There's no challenge there for me.
I think that's right. I do think that is a function that is in the marketplace for true crime right now, is to I think in Williams' book, to really sort of settle some issues in an unsettled case from the community, in part because maybe there were incomplete narratives before.
Well, you mentioned the hate mail, and I won't get into detail, but to give you an example, I received a series of emails, I think last week or week before last, from a lady who said, "I've heard that you've got a book out. Well, in case you didn't know, let me tell you about all the evidence." And she sends me 3 or 4 emails telling me about all the evidence that I supposedly had ignored. I said, "Well, may I suggest that you might want to buy and read my book because I address all these issues?" And she said, "Well, I know the truth. I don't need to read your book." I mean, and in many, this is extremely tangential, but I'll give one sentence. In reasoning, in making judgments, you cannot prove a negative. In other words, how do you know you won't be killed by a falling meteor on your way home today? Well, you might, but the odds are slim. Or the other thing is what's called narrative fallacy and confirmation bias. That is to say, you make a statement and then, by the way, pick very selective. Yes, we have a tremendously bad history of racism in Columbus, and this guy just happened to be black. And so it's obviously that, and you pick other episodes. It's difficult to deal with this, and as I said a moment ago, I try to present the facts uncolored and untinged by my opinion and let people make their own decision.
In the time that we have left, and I think this is something that readers always like to hear about, in doing the research, where was your aha moment? Where was the point in doing the research where you thought, "Oh, I cannot believe I found this," or "This is really where the book is going to turn"? And who are the characters in your book you can't leave behind that are going to stick with you?
In my case, I'll talk about my last book because I had a really big aha moment. Again, it was this by now 50-year-old murder that I was talking about, and in my research, people kept mentioning certain names. And they kept repeating and repeating, which is not evidence. It's anecdotal, it's supportive, but it's not evidence. And one name in particular kept coming up, and this was a man who is serving a life sentence for poisoning to death his 5-year-old daughter, so you know what we're working with here. I told him I wanted to come to prison and speak with him. I didn't tell him, I'd tell him my name, but I didn't tell him what the case was about. I didn't mention anything. He surprised me, as these things happen. He said, "Yeah, I'll come and you can visit me and I'll talk to you." We went into this prison day room. Before I could ask a question, he essentially confessed to the murder that I was looking into. So it's not as if, I baited the hook in any way, but he was ready to talk, and he must have figured out what the murder was. And, I thought, well, I'm a hero now. It turns out he's both psychotic and a pathological liar, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't telling the truth. But it turns out there was not enough evidence, or the investigators, I think, were covering their asses from their first screw up of the case, and they have straight-armed me almost whenever I've gone to them, and I found out that they lost fingerprints, they lost DNA. DNA has been degraded. So, but that was an aha moment. I thought, I'm home free, which it turns out I wasn't home free, but it was, a real aha moment that it wasn't confirmation bias, because I didn't tell him why I was there. And he couldn't have known because I didn't write about anything about the case until I saw him. But that was my aha moment, I guess.
Going back to something I said at the beginning about this sort of naivete that I had about, I think, the Department of Justice and the way in which these cases are investigated. For me, my aha moment was getting these boxes and boxes and boxes of evidence, many of which had been deliberately withheld from the defense, which is not supposed to happen in federal cases, and realizing just how far the federal government, both the FBI and the DOJ, was willing to go to try to coerce a confession from this person who, by all accounts, is innocent. Millions and millions and millions of dollars went into what, in my opinion, is this sort of malfeasance, an attempt to frame this individual who has profound mental health issues. All the while, no resources were being spent doing what would have been a very cheap DNA test to confirm that this known serial killer's DNA, which could not be excluded from the DNA at the site, was in fact the killer. And so just kind of understanding the way in which confirmation bias just, I think, really blindly leads these investigators down some really dark and indefensible paths was really illuminating for me.
In terms of aha moments, I don't think there was any for me in terms of the progress of the case, the evidence of the case. The shocking thing about this book was getting to know the victims. And you cannot write a book about horrific murders without feeling a great deal of empathy for the victims. These were elderly women. The poor elderly Florence Scheibel, 89 years old, 10 days shy of 90. She was essentially blind. She was essentially deaf. She had just gotten out of the hospital with a broken hip, intended to walk around in her yard picking up leaves as best she could. Or the poor woman whose son put the lock on her door and happened to put it in backwards, and so all the Strangler had to do to get it in her house was unscrew the lock. Or the poor lady who found her, who was protected by her small dog who'd been killed in a run over by a car a week or two before her death. And you find out little things like this. These were aha moments.
Which, yeah, I know. I found that very striking in your book. How these women were introduced, and you really wanted to see justice done for them. And let's talk a little bit about some of the characters that really stick with you. I think, as writers, the deeper we get into the research, we really form sort of bonds with these people we do not know, can never know, but they do stick with us. Catherine, I know you have those stories, and why don't you start?
Yeah, like I said earlier, for me it really came down to wanting to somehow honor this amazing legacy that Lolly and Julie had already started. They were these incredible social activists. They were these outdoor leaders. They had already done so much, and they were poised to do so much more. And I think in my darkest days working on this book, and I think maybe because I had been a sexual assault victim and then survivor, that there was sort of this added layer, sort of emotional weight to this. And so it did really take me to some pretty dark places. And the one way I could get out of those dark places was to keep thinking, about Lolly and Julie. Like, can I work on their behalf? And that's what really compelled me, I think.
I also, again, I'll go to my previous true crime book. This woman's name was Nancy Dean Morgan. Again, she was a year older than I was, but from the time it happened, I remember the day the first news account appeared of her disappearance, and then they found her body. I knew that this was important. I didn't know how it would be important, but as I researched her life, she was more and more like me and many of my friends from that time. I got to be friends with her brother. Her father had died. Her mother was about to succumb to Alzheimer's. But I felt like I was with her, and that this horrible thing had happened to her. It had never been solved, and she was always on my mind. And the more I learned about her, the more I liked her. In the new book, the young person was not from my cohort. He was 24, and I was 65. But through my sister-in-law, I could see he was a seeker. He was interested in Eastern religions, New Age religions, and he was always searching for enlightenment. And it was always, when you have a double parasite, often it's a spoiled kid, a grabby rich kid, or the parents were indulgent, or the parents didn't care. There were no villains in this new book. Everybody was everybody was trying their hardest. His parents were trying to keep him from slipping into, bipolar disorder, finished. He was not a grabby kid. He'd never asked for a lot of money. He was altruistic. He did all these wonderful things. And it just, at some point, and I've written this before, I couldn't work on the book after 9 o'clock at night because I identified with his parents, but also to some degree with him. And, you can't take that to bed with you because you'll never sleep if you do that.
Mm-hmm. I think that in reading all of your books, there are some wide awake moments in all of your books. Have you, as we start to close here, all of our books are out in the marketplace now. You've had an opportunity to get some reaction from readers. How have they reached out to you? What have you heard?
Why were you getting hate mail?
Well, I mean...
William, please tell us about lines of people around the block wanting to... Because I know, Mark, I've been at the book signing when no one shows up, so I'd like to hear what it's like to have people lined up around the block to get your book.
If you have half an hour, I can tell you about all the book signings I've been to where no one shows up, or, I sit there for 2 hours and, I've sold 2 books, that's great. No, as I've said before, I'm not the greatest writer in the world. I do a yeoman job, I think. But in this case, this particular book, my latest, the Columbus Strangler, it's the story, it's the message and not the messenger. It's not the writer, it's the story that I'm writing about that's so moving. Last Sunday, I went to Columbus, and literally for 4 hours, they were out the door around the block.
That sounds exhausting. I hate it for you.
And my wife went with me, and I told her, I said, listen, we've only got one case of books. Don't do anything. And she sold all the books under my nose, and it was good. It was good. I think. I'm not sure. A little disconcerted by it.
Mark, what sort of reaction have you gotten?
I've written a lot of books. I've had 800 people show up, and I've had nobody show up.
Right.
When I went to Montgomery recently, where the murders took place, we had 50 people. Every chair was taken, but it was a little intimidating because everybody in there, I later learned, knew both victims. So they knew more about these people in life than I did. They had been at parties at their house. But they said, we learned some stuff about Brent Jr. and the family that the family never shared with us. And so they thanked me for that, and that was gratifying.
Yeah, I can say when you are in the setting where your nonfiction true crime book is set, and you're talking to people who are like, I went to grammar school with that person, or I lived down the street from where they lived. It is sort of a unique experience. You don't get that in any other setting.
Just after I published this book, the FBI, who did not talk to me and were not interested in having me on a task force, did read it, and they gave it to the victims' families and asked them to dog ear pages that they thought might be relevant, which I thought was an interesting investigative tactic. But they really drilled down on 4 park rangers who figure pretty prominently in the park, in the book, and one of them in particular decided that was my fault, and he really came at me, and it got very aggressive and very scary. We ended up having to cancel my Mid-Atlantic tour, and then I had police protection for a while, which was utterly bizarre. But, it's almost kind of like the lady doth protest too much. Like, part of me is like, why are you willing to sort of embark upon this sort of systemized harassment that I'm keeping track of, and so what exactly are you trying to hide? So the show, it's been optioned as a TV show, so we're working on that right now, and it'll give me a chance to, I think, keep up with this investigation and ask some of these questions that I didn't get a chance to ask in the book.
Yeah, yours is very much a continuing story. You can tell at the end of the book that you anticipate news off of your book, and so that's awesome. Listen, I'd like to thank all three of you for the time you've given here today and for writing such wonderful books. I enjoyed reading them. I know that I heartily encourage everyone to go out there and get them while they can. They're fabulous books written by really smart, fabulous. But yes, sir.
And if they run out outside, I'll be at Tall Tales tomorrow at 2 o'clock in Toco Shopping Center.
Sure, sure. Anybody else got, Catherine, you running any more races before you leave Atlanta, or are you heading out of town? Or and William, do you have any other appearances coming up?
Yes, let's see. I'll be in Columbus on Tuesday and Wednesday, Wednesday and Thursday this coming week, and then I'll be speaking in Edenton, Georgia, at the Old School History Museum on next Sunday, and then it's on my website. It's just my name with www.com after it, kind of thing. Anyway, if anybody's interested.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.